as evidence that all the 27 books that we call the New Testament were written before that.
Okay, this is Wes Huff. You might have heard of him. He just went viral because he had a recent debate with Billy Carson where Billy seems a bit embarrassed by it, but I'm telling you, look that up. This guy is legit. He is so articulate and he knows his stuff. So give it a chance and listen to how he backs up his theory of why the Gospels were dated so early.
Is it true that the New Testament manuscripts were written before 70 AD? If so, what's the best evidence that proves that? The Judeo-Roman historian Josephus, he places the siege of Jerusalem in the second year of the Roman Emperor Vespasian, which corresponds with the year 70 AD. So that's where we get that number from. And some point to the lack of anyone mentioning this whole event taking place in the New Testament as evidence that all the 27 books that we call the New Testament were written before that. Let me zero down on this question by just outlining why I do think a particular group of New Testament documents are relatively early, because I think there are some pretty reasonable evidences for the synoptic gospels, that being Matthew, Mark, Luke. Matthew, Mark, and Luke having a pre-70 early date. So I actually think we can work backwards from this argument and start with the book of Acts.
Now, this is one of the very first concepts that started my journey, where all of a sudden the lights came on and I was like, okay, this tracks. Logically, this makes sense.
And the argument basically goes like this. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts have the same author. Acts, as we can read in its preface, precedes the Gospel. So it's part 1 and part 2. And a big part of the narrative of Acts is the relationship of Peter and Paul as apostle brothers in Christ. Now, Luke mentions a number of individuals' deaths in Acts, but he doesn't say anything about Peter or Paul's death. And we know from extra-biblical writings that are relatively reliable and can be corroborated, that Paul was martyred in the city of Rome, somewhere between 64 and 67 AD. And Peter's death is recorded as sometime just prior or around the time of the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. So both Peter and Paul are martyred in the same city around the same time. And I think given the concentration of these two individuals by Luke within Acts, it doesn't make sense for him to have been writing after the events took place, and he just doesn't mention them.
So Luke mentions the other deaths, but not Peter or Paul. That would be peculiar, you know. That would be the capstone of the gospel right there, of Acts right there, showing Paul's death. So he didn't put that. He didn't put the siege of Jerusalem. You got to think there's a reason for that. It hadn't happened yet.
So, for that reason, I think it makes sense that given these facts, Acts had to have been written at least as early as 63 or 64. And if Luke precedes Acts, because Acts is the follow-up volume to Luke's Gospel, then we obviously have to date Luke before 63 or 64. In fact, some have pointed out that when Paul uses the description of the Lord's Supper in 1 Corinthians 11, he appears to be quoting the words of Jesus. And those specific words of Jesus said in that specific way correspond with Luke's recounting of the Lord's Supper event. And in 1 Corinthians, even by some of the latest dating, it has been placed between 53 and 57 AD. So I think if Paul is quoting Luke's Gospel, then Luke could be as early as 53. Now, Luke is generally considered to be after Matthew and Mark. He's at minimum after Mark, and there's debate about whether Luke knew Matthew's Gospel or not. The general consensus is that Luke comes after Matthew and Mark, and so therefore, I don't think it's crazy to put Matthew in the late 40s and Mark in the late 30s. Now, why do I put Mark so early? Well, if you saw my answer to the question of the longer ending of Mark from my last Facebook Live, I mentioned the theory that Mark's Gospel could have been a prequel to the creed Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15, that he was passing on of first importance. Those are the words he uses. Now, regarding the creed in 1 Corinthians 15.
Now, this Corinthians verse is my favorite in terms of how early it dates this message. So Paul talks about receiving this message, passing it on, receiving, the Greek word is paralambano, for passing on, it's paradidomi, and what this relates to is the Greek philosophy school of thought, as well as the rabbinical school of thought of this tradition of passing things down, this history, this oral tradition of passing things down. So Paul's receiving what is clearly and concisely put down to memorize and pass on quickly and, sink it into your memory. So that puts this, the early Christians reciting this within months of the cross. That's insane.
There's a German scholar named Ulrich Wickens who has stated that the material found in this creedal statement in 1 Corinthians 15 goes back to the earliest phase of primitive Christianity. And if UK scholar Gerald O'Collins is right, which I think he is, he says that this creed should be placed in the mid-30s. At the latest, scholars place it at 40 AD. So if Gerald O'Collins is correct, and the creed is mid-30s, and Mark is writing a prequel to the creed, then it isn't crazy to hypothesize it being written in the late 30s. That's how I get that. So minimally, that places all three synoptic gospels well within the boundaries of between 35 and 64 AD. That's how I would reason that out.
And we also have, with the epistles especially, we have a chain of custody. We know exactly where these letters went. After Paul, they kept going. So we know exactly where they went. We can track them. We know they weren't changed.
The 27 books that we call the New Testament are our earliest source material for the life of Jesus and the earliest followers of Jesus. No one truly argues against that fact.
Okay, now check this out. This is really cool.
And the New Testament is a collection of documents that comes from the century of the first eyewitnesses, whether they were written a year after Jesus died or 70 years after Jesus died. They were being written, compiled, and circulated in the time of the living memory of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection.
Okay, now this was a common objection I used to hear all the time is, the Gospels are written hundreds of years later, plenty of time for a legend to be formed. But when I found out that the New Testament was written that close to the resurrection, within decades, it just blew my mind. That is not enough time for a legend to be formed. Not to mention, Paul said, hey, I'm not the only one who saw this. There are over 500 people who saw the same thing, and many of them are still alive today. Meaning, if you don't believe me, go ask them. Who would have that kind of confidence to assert something like that? To claim a lie when he could have been called out at any time? It just doesn't make sense. And when you're still combating this, you've got to ask yourself, is there a veil over my eyes? Because logically, this is clear as day. This happened.
They were being written, compiled, and circulated in the time of the living memory of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection.
If you're on this same journey and perhaps you have doubts and you want questions answered, or you just want to equip your faith with the objective facts and logic that back up our worldview, please feel free to subscribe. We will travel this journey together, share with anyone of the same mind, and it would truly be an honor to do it together, equip our faith, and prepare the way. In Jesus' name, amen.